Hey y'all, this is another planning period with Wesley, and today we are going to plan for SS8H11. Let's jump into it and get started. So I am trying to make these videos a little bit shorter. Let's see just how much of this standard I can get in let's say 12 minutes. Might not do it, but let's give it a try. So today in SS8H11, we're going to talk about Georgia in the modern civil rights movement. So the whole standard is dedicated to the civil rights movement in the 1940s and 50s and the 60s. So we're going to look at people, individuals, we're going to look at groups, and we're going to look at events that either helped bring about civil rights or was fighting against equality in Georgia. So for example, in element A, let's look at element A first. It says that we're going to examine or explain Georgia's response to Brown versus Board of Education, including that it's going to give you two things to look specifically at in the response to Brown versus BOE. And those two things are the 1956 flag and the Sibley Commission. So let's start with Brown versus Board of Education. You're going to have to give students that background knowledge of what the Brown versus Board of Education is. Now, hopefully they've heard this along the way. I'm pretty sure this was a standard maybe in 5th grade, but you're going to have to remind them that Brown versus Board of Education was one of those Supreme Court decisions that changed laws in the individual state. Basically, it said that you could not have separate but equal, and it basically demanded that public places be integrated, such as schools. Well, Georgia being a southern state, students should know by now that the southern states are resisting equality for blacks. We've already talked about groups like the KKK. We've already talked about anti-Semitic movements in the Leo Frank trial. We have talked about resistance to the Freedmen's Bureau. And so ask students, how do they think Georgia in the 1950s would have responded to a judgment like this from the Supreme Court that said they had to integrate their schools? Then go ahead and tell them, and by the way, I would mention that the court ruled 9-0. This was not a close case. The Georgia General Assembly supported, and they passed statements saying that Georgia would, quote, have a massive resistance to the federal government. And the governor at the time, Governor Ernest Vandiver, asked the citizens of Georgia to render their judgment regarding the controversy through a commission. He appointed a segregationist lawyer who believed in resisting government mandates. He believed that resisting government mandates was useless, but he asked him to lead a commission, which is going to be a vocabulary word for students that they have to understand. Basically, he set up panels around the state to get input from Georgians. After the Sibley Commission, John Sibley, the segregationist lawyer, issued his verdict, and he said that the state should comply somewhat with the federal government. He believed that that was the best way to get the federal government to back off and to appease Georgians who wanted segregation. 60% of Georgians claimed that they would rather close public schools rather than integrate. That's what he found during his commission. Despite the findings, Sibley pushed for schools to desegregate only on a limited basis, and eventually Governor Vandiver knew that it was pointless to resist the federal government, and Atlanta desegregated its schools in 1961. Remember, the second way that we were supposed to show resistance is through the flag. Georgia changed its state flag in the late 1960s at the height of this new equality for African Americans to represent the Confederate flag. So allow students to draw conclusions. Why do they believe that the Georgia Assembly approved this new flag, this Confederate flag, right when African Americans were getting more rights, like free and fair education or better education through Brown versus Board of Education. You're going to go over, hopefully they will draw the conclusion that it was a sign that Georgia would always support segregation and white supremacy in the South. And that's what that Confederate flag was when the state was rebelling against the federal government against on the issue of slavery and others, what they call states' rights issues. You can show them the 4 different flags that Georgia has had since the 1920s, but the main point here is to show them that before Brown versus Board of Education and the modern civil rights movement, Georgia had dropped the Confederate symbol. So it's not like they had it the whole time. They dropped it and they brought it back in 1956. You can tell them that in 2001, a governor actually lost re-election because he took away the Confederate flag. And Georgians were so angry, they call it the Barnes Rag. And the Barnes Rag was a flag that Governor Roy Barnes thought would put to rest the controversy. It did not. And in 2004 is when we adopted our current flag, and it does not have the Confederate symbol on it. Now, if you go back to the Barnes Rag, what they call the Barnes Rag, it was supposed to be a compromise, because you can even see on the Georgia flag from 2001-2004 that the Confederate flag has a place at the bottom of that flag. So that is element A, looking at the Sibley Commission, looking at the flag controversy, and all of those were in response to Brown versus Board of Education. So that is pretty much concluding that, and we'll move on to element B. In element B, we are going to look at the individuals, the groups, and the events that had an impact on the modern civil rights movement in Georgia. The individuals specifically that the standard calls us to look for is Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis. Students are going to have a very long experience and understanding of Martin Luther King. They've been studying him since kindergarten, but they're going to have less of a understanding of who John Lewis is. Draw on the experience and the knowledge that they already have. This is a great place to do something like a KWL chart where they already tell you what they know, because they're going to have lots of things that they know about Martin Luther King. And then you can ask them what they would like to know, and then go back at the end and ask them what they learned about Martin Luther King and John Lewis. I don't know how much biographical information you want to go over on either one of these individuals, because to be honest, it's not really a part of the standards to know their biography, but it is to know their impact on the civil rights movement. However, if you look in the teacher's notes, there is lots of information on their biography. I am going to skip that part. It might be good for you to share with your students just to increase their background knowledge and their interest, but we're going to jump right into how Martin Luther King impacted the civil rights movement. One way that he did that is by leading a boycott in Montgomery on the buses. I'm going to wrap this up really quickly because you and your students might already know a lot about it, but basically, as a preacher in Montgomery, Alabama, Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the leaders who encouraged African Americans to avoid riding the segregated bus system in Montgomery, Alabama, because they felt like if they paid the same fares as white people, why should they have to sit in a certain section? This boycott was successful in that it did desegregate the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama after a very long time. Please tell students that this was not an easy task. African Americans had to walk for miles. So maybe you can do a simulation with them to ask them if they couldn't ride the bus and they didn't have cars, because most people in the inner cities of Montgomery didn't have cars. Make them calculate, maybe with Google Maps, how far they would have to walk to school, how far their parents would have to walk to work, how far they would have to walk to the grocery store, to football practice, and to let them see that this was a huge sacrifice and it was not easy for Martin Luther King to persuade people to do this, but it was successful. You can also talk about how he had success in starting the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. We're going to talk later about what that is, because that's one of the groups that we have to study, but basically it was a way to get Southern pastors, preachers, ministers to lead their congregants and their communities for equal rights. You can talk about how he had a successful voter registration campaign in Selma, Alabama, and this eventually led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And you can also talk about how he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Students should know somewhat about the Nobel Peace Prize because they studied last year in 7th grade about Nelson Mandela winning that same prize. Students are already going to know about the I Have a Dream speech that he gave on the March on Washington. Let's move on to John Lewis. And John Lewis was a longtime congressman from Georgia. Again, his biographical information is in the Georgia Notes. But what you want students to understand is that John Lewis was an ally of Martin Luther King. He was a part of the 600 marchers who went across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. What become known as Bloody Sunday. Talk to students about how technology helped this movement, because without Bloody Sunday being on television, the nation's conscience wouldn't have been shocked about the things that were going on in the South. He was elected to, please tell them that he got permanent damage from that march. He bore the scars in his face, on his head, when he was beaten by policemen, literally for simply crossing a bridge, walking across a bridge with, peaceful protesters. You're also going to talk about how he became a congressman. In 1986, he was elected, and he was one of the very longest serving congressmen ever from the state of Georgia. Talking about groups that were formed, we're going to, all of these kind of tie into each other because, for example, John Lewis was a part of SNCC, which is SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Martin Luther King started the SCLC. So all of these things kind of flow together. So let's talk about SNCC. Have students understand that SNCC, the S in SNCC, starts for Student Nonviolence. So this is mostly on college campuses with a lot of our historically black colleges and universities. And they would have freedom rides and freedom summer, and they declared freedom summer in Mississippi, where they went and registered people to vote. They were beaten, they were jailed, some of them even killed for this movement, that they would go to these cities and register black people to vote. Please, sit-ins are a big part of this movement, so explain to students what sit-ins are. When these leaders, these activists would go and sit at counters and demand service, these segregated counters. This is going to come up later when we talk about the governor of Georgia, Lester Maddox, who had a restaurant who would not serve black people, called the Pickrick Cafe. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, again, was created in 1957 in a reaction to the Montgomery bus boycott. It was led by Dr. Martin Luther King, and it is again those leaders in the Christian church, him motivating them to fight for equality and rights in their community. Today, it's still around, SCLC, and it advocates for causes such as healthcare, prison reform, fair treatment of refugees, and job site safety. We also have to talk about some movements. The Albany movement, it was pretty much seen as a failed movement by Martin Luther King. You can have a conversation with students about successes and failures of everyone, of leaders. It's kind of a SEL conversation you can have, that we don't always succeed, but we learn from our failures, because Martin Luther King learned, he had valuable experience from his failure in integrating Albany. It was probably not the best strategy to try to integrate an entire community, but he learned from that, and that's when he went on to his successful Montgomery bus boycott, or excuse me, not his Montgomery bus boycott, but his successful campaigns in Birmingham, in Atlanta. Now, there's a great video by PBS, Georgia Stories, about how they would use songs and singing. This started in Albany to really move the protesters and move the community. I'll put that link down in the show notes below. All right. So the Albany movement was a unsuccessful bid to desegregate the entire city of Albany, Georgia. The March on Washington students are going to know more about. I think the most important thing to say about the March on Washington, it was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. A lot of what they were protesting is African Americans not having access to good paying jobs. I have seen a lot of sample questions on released Georgia tests, and it always talks about the March on Washington as far as jobs and equality more than just racial equality. So make sure that your students know that March on Washington was 250,000 people marching, but for jobs and equality, economic equality for blacks. And that's where he gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. It would be great for you to play that speech to students. They should hear it, if not in whole, at least in part. Let's go over Element C together. Element C says explain the resistance to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, emphasizing the role of Lester Maddox. Now, students should be picking up on a pattern here that progress continues to be met with resistance. In Element A, the progress of Brown versus Board of Education was met with the resistance of the flag and the Sibley Commission. And now here we are, the 1964 Civil Rights Act is passed, and then it's met with resistance at the state level. So you're obviously going to have to tell students what the 1964 Civil Rights Act was, passed by Lyndon B. Johnson in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King. That's probably not important for the Georgia standard, but it might be an interesting tidbit for students to know that Lyndon B. Johnson used the death of the previous president to move Congress to action, saying that this would have been his dying wish, basically. That JFK wanted to do this, let's do it in his honor. The 1964 Civil Rights Act forbade discrimination on the basis of sex and race in hiring, promoting, and firing. Okay, so that is the purpose of it. The Southern Congressional Democrats, led by our very own Senator Richard Russell, which they have studied, strongly opposed the passage of this legislation. And it was during this period of great social and political change in Georgia that the future governor, Lester Maddox, gained notoriety. So basically the story of Lester Maddox is he was a high school dropout. He worked in the Bell Bomber plant, which would be a good review, spiral review for that standard. I think it's SS8H11 or 10 about the Bell Bomber plant. He actually worked in the Bell Bomber plant. And in 1947, this individual opened a cafeteria called the Pick Rick Cafeteria near the campus of Georgia Tech. It was a segregated restaurant, and when sit-ins took place, Lester Maddox became famous for throwing the peaceful protesters out that were demanding service in his restaurant. He was throwing them out forcefully. Once he did it with a gun, and he became most famous for doing it with the handles of axes that became known as Pick Rick drumsticks, and he would forcibly remove these African Americans out of his restaurant. And Georgians loved it and elected him as governor in 1966. Now, what's interesting is he actually did not win the popular vote, but he was selected by the Georgia Assembly, which is a great government tie-in. You could talk about the role of the state government in elections. So he didn't win the popular vote, but because neither won the majority of the vote, he was selected by the good old legislator who thought, hey, let's get this guy in office. He was the state's lastly openly segregationist governor. And ironically, I don't really understand this. Maybe you can do more research and leave your comments below. He appointed more African Americans to government positions than any prior Georgia governors combined. Now, I'm sure that's not a very high bar, but it is something that's interesting that you should tell students. He also had something called Little People's Days, which is not what you might think. It is not a dig at people who are on the shorter end. He was not calling them midgets. But Little People's Days is still very insulting, was for the working man to come twice a month to stand in line to meet with the governor. And so people like that, both blacks and whites. Now, he was also, again, not surprisingly, criticized for he refusing to fly the state flag at half-mast during the death of Martin Luther King Jr. Obviously, a dog whistle that he did not respect in that way the work of Martin Luther King, who was an Atlanta and Georgia native. Interestingly enough, our lieutenant governor does not have to be in the same party with the governor. Another great government standard to tie in here, because Mr. Maddox was actually the lieutenant governor of one Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter was obviously very much for integration. He actually, in his first inauguration, stood on the state capitol and said that he was for integration. More black people attended his inauguration than any other governor of Georgia at that time. And so, of course, Lester Maddox often clashed with Jimmy Carter. Lester Maddox was governor. His governorship stopped when he ran out of terms. He was term limited. That is pretty much wraps up Element C. I'll stop right there to save us some time. And hopefully you've learned a lot in this lesson planning with Teach This Teacher, Wesley Glosson. And I hope that you check out the links below for some really great resources to teach this standard. I have a great gallery walk and other resources that your students will be both engaged and informed with. And they're all there, as long as some other links that'll help you teach this standard. Thanks, everyone. See you later.